Salam everyone, I'm Reza and welcome to the Sum of Our Network. Today's discussion, we will be over identity and protest. And what does that mean? We will be discussing the Afghan-American role with regards to the Black Lives Matter movement and the recent attacks in Kabul will help us understand our role in the wider Muslim American community. So with those two topics in mind, I want to introduce or have our panel introduce themselves. I'll go first. My name is Reza. I live in Los Angeles, and I am a Kaplan instructor. So Rosh, if you want to introduce yourself, please.
Salam everyone. My name is Arash. I'm from the Northern Virginia, D.C. area. I work for the Voice of America in broadcast journalism. And a little bit about myself is I've covered Capitol Hill, Occupy Wall Street movement, and the unrest in Baltimore.
Arzo?
Hi, salam everybody. I'm Arzo from Washington, D.C. I'm the director of the Alliance in Support of the Afghan People, a bipartisan coalition. I work mainly on the Hill, and that's about it.
Nura? Go ahead, Omar.
Salam everybody. My name is Omar Aziz from Fremont, California. Currently calling in from DC, but yeah, I grew up in the Bay Area. Work at UC Santa Cruz, working in education for a couple years now.
Awesome. Hopefully Nura comes back. Nura is an amazing panelist who's a part of the Sound of Our Network a long time. She's a PhD student at Duke who can provide really good insight into some of the history and context regarding the Black Lives Matter movement. So hopefully she can rejoin when her camera unfreezes. Now, to get into the meat of this, I wanted to begin by asking the sort of broad general question, and hopefully one of the panelists can narrow it down. But being a minority community in America, what role do Americans play in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, especially when we have the recent shootings, not so recent, a month ago, on July 5th and 6th, of Alton Sterling, Orlando Castile, in Baton Rouge and Falcon Heights, Minnesota, so Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Falcon Heights, Minnesota. That's spurred renewed conversation. And so what is the role of another minority community, our minority community, in that movement? So I want to throw this over to Arash first.
I think a lot of people make a lot of different arguments about why Afghan American as a subset of the American population need to care about black lives, the black bodies of American citizens. But the first argument should always just be pure humanity. They are disproportionately targeted. They are disproportionately policed. We have an obligation, not only as Muslims or an immigrant population, but out of sheer solidarity out of our hearts to care for our fellow citizens and our fellow human beings. So and I think that should always be our first argument.
You know, part of, I think for me, just you know, why I care, why I think it's important for us. You know, we have to look within our own community and really see how we are contributing to what is going on in in society, and how we may be playing a part in that, and whether that's like directly or indirectly, passively. We all kind of play a role in this. So I think if we are to try to change any of it, I think it's important for us to really find a way to address those things. So for me, it's partly personal and just kind of looking at what I'm doing and how I'm contributing and how I can try to solve it and make it better in some way.
Can you dig a little deeper into what you mean by like passively like contributing?
I think, we've talked about this. I mean, in our last conversation we had on Black Lives Matter, we talked about like things that we do. We've, as an Afghan, we borrowed a lot from Black culture and like, whether it's hip hop music, whether it's fashion style, whatever it may be, we borrowed quite a bit, but we don't realize sometimes what we might be, um, like appropriating or whatever it might be. We use like the use of the N word is something that we always bring up, right? Like the use of the N word is something that we always do, but how does that contribute to how we view Black people and how much we, you started the conversation with how we respect Black bodies, and if we're kind of disrespecting them by using that word, how does that contribute to other things that happen? And I think that for me, that's some of the things that come up.
Okay. So I wanted to take that passive contribution and what Arash was saying about our role as human beings first to contribute and stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Movement and ask if, I don't know, there might be some context that either Noura or Arzo could provide for that. Maybe some experiences that you've seen within the community of the kinds of contributions that Omar was talking about. Either one of you. Doesn't matter. I'll call on Arzo.
Um, are we talking about professionally or just on a volunteer?
Both, yeah. I mean, personally and professionally, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think Arash is a really good example of that as well. The fact that, he in his professional capacity covers stories like this, and he also has there's that, I wouldn't say he doesn't have a racial affinity. It's not a racial affinity, but, I guess a bit of a minority affinity, if that's what you want to call it, with uh, the black population. And coming from that perspective, he also uses his social media platform, which I know to be true because I'm part of his Facebook. We're Facebook friends, and so my point is that he doesn't just do it in a professional capacity, but he also takes his time outside of that to inform others. And I think that knowledge sharing is one of the best ways we can contribute. Oftentimes, just engaging in conversation with people is enough to, just to start something. What Omar did with TSN, it began with the Baltimore Risings, right? And that essentially triggered this conversation about having a panel, and we were essentially, it was the beginning of something great. So I feel like, having thought-provoking conversations is a really good way to contribute to the conversation. Appearing at protests obviously is another way as well, but definitely what we've been doing so far is, sorry, I'm going blank here, but that's the way that's what I'm focusing on right now. So if anybody else has anything else to contribute.
Noura, considering that we've had conversations in the past before about contextualizing movements like Black Lives Matter, can you talk a little bit about like contextualizing that and how that relates to the Afghan-American experience? So yeah, contextualizing the Black Lives Matter movement, but also yeah.
Is my connection good?
Your connection is great.
Okay, so I think this is a conversation I've had with my mom and dad when people were taking their citizenship exams. Like when my grandfather was taking it, he would memorize questions and go in. So they learn like a bare minimum of history, right? But we've come in as immigrants, really not knowing the history of Black Americans, and it's something I've talked a lot about with my family. Is that Black Lives Matter is not something that's happened in a vacuum, and one of the things I commend like Afghans our age, young Afghans, is that we're like, where is this coming from? And I think that the deep history of the legacy of Jim Crow, more so like moving beyond slavery, what's happened to the Black American population, like the remnants of Jim Crow laws in the South, how Black Americans were segregated, even now, like where they live, the history of police brutality. Like, these are experiences that have like a deep historical memory that are passed down from generation to generation. And it's not something that comes up on a citizenship exam that Afghans take when they become US citizens. And it's something that we really have to like take a moment and learn. And I think that when people think about Black Lives Matter and the way they read it in a newspaper article, they get a very superficial and artificial understanding of just how deep rooted the history is and the suffering is. And that's one of the things that I think I wish we were more prepared to learn about. And now that Black Lives Matter is happening, the one thing I think that we need to take more time in understanding is like, where does this come from? Like, this movement is based on the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement is something that hasn't ended, and it continues and it manifests in different ways. But that suffering that was existing in the 1960s is not one that's left. It's just changed, and it looks different for people now than it did decades ago. But if you ask young Black activists now if the country looks better for them today than it did 60 years ago, some people would say it doesn't. And I think that's an important perspective that we really need to take seriously when we have these conversations.
And so, Omar, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I guess it's just kind of, bringing up the whole notion of just like knowing the history, and I don't know. I guess I just kind of struggle with that. Is like, what do we, how do we can't. Not everyone has that background and that knowledge on the history of what Black folks have suffered through in this country, and how do we as a community, this is just a question more so than anything, like how do we as a community really still be allies and still strive to be allies and try to help without knowing that people aren't going to sit there and listen to like lectures on Jim Crow and like how that has affected people for hundreds of years. And so I don't know, I'm just that's something that I struggle with, is like every time somebody has a issue with Black Lives Matter or like don't understand it, it's like no, we got to give them this like long history lesson. And yeah, that's something that I just wrestle with and struggle with, so that I wondering how other people deal with that or how they handle that.
Yeah, and it can be casual conversation, and I think it depends on everyone's family. But like, I was on a road trip with my family this weekend, and it's like my 16-year-old cousin's bringing it up, and her dad's asking her about it in the car, right? And it was super casual because I think it started about us talking about a movie, and it suddenly trends like Black Lives Matter. And so I think that even those random moments when you're stuck in the car with your family, to bring it up, because like you said, like people aren't necessarily going to go out of their way to go to a university lecture or even a community lecture, but like those little openings we have, like when we're sitting around with family, where like will randomly come up, and I just seize those moments to have those conversations. But I'm curious what like Arash or handle it. That's sort of.
I think we lost you for a second, Nura. So, Arash, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, and just to, I agree with everyone said, and I want to emphasize Nura's point that so like our social media really gives us an easy ability to like have some sort of conversation. You can post a message and it's either liked or seen by like dozens of people or like hundreds of people, depending on how big your network is. But I don't think that's enough, and I see this kind of conversation. I see it in parts of our social media network, but I don't see it in other places. Today I walked by a church, and it says end racism, and it says Black Lives Matter, and it's I think this is a Baptist church. And that's not the first church I've seen that has that, for example. So this conversation needs to happen in all segments of our community, and I definitely see it missing. I don't hear this conversation happening in any of our mosques, and I'm speaking anecdotally, but I don't see this conversation happen when we're hanging out in large group settings with other Afghans, and that kind of disappoints me. And I do think we have an obligation to have that conversation and to push that conversation onto each other and push the envelope a little bit. And just we shouldn't just be able to post things on our Facebook and think that's enough.
So I guess, I don't know, maybe to be a little bit blunt here, but I think a lot of us Afghans just simply don't have either that many or enough black friends, and I find that to be problematic. I actually have a lot. I have a lot of black friends, and I grew up with many of them as well. I understand their culture. I get along with them very great, and we end up getting into a lot of conversations about issues that face our community as well. But it's funny because no matter how much we may face in our own community, you can't ever really compare it to their own struggles and what they go through, but just engaging with them and hearing out their challenges on their level, not just reading about it on the news, really says something. So why is it that we just don't have enough black friends? Why is it that we see a lot of Afghans not having a lot of black people within their social circles? That's I think an interesting thing that I've found a lot, that a lot of my, and I also sometimes when I'm hosting an event of some sort, I even find myself wondering why I typically have only all Afghan events and don't really bring in my black friends to those events. I kind of keep my black friends together with everyone else, but I don't know what it is. Is it because maybe I feel like my Afghan friends won't be that comfortable around them, or maybe they won't find anything to talk about? So I feel like that is something we should explore, and I don't know if you guys have any, if any of you guys have any sort of thoughts as to why that is, why that's so.
I think one thing is like I think a lot of times rely a lot on. And I was having this conversation with a friend of mine who's, an activist in Southern California uh, about black folks, black people often being like emotional mules for everyone else, and like in the sense that like unless like we always have to have it somehow in our face in front of us, suffering. We always have to compare it to our struggles. We always have to compare it to like things that we're doing in order for us to care, and it's trying to remove that and being able to have these conversations within our communities and take some action within our communities to change these things, and hopefully you know forming some more like widespread widespread change, for lack of a better word, because obviously there's a problem. So yeah, for me it's really trying not to further, I guess, further oppress people by always making them be the ones to, like, being the token person to talk on a certain issue or having to speak on these things. Sometimes people just don't want to. So I think it's more for us, like Arzo said, to really you know branch out and to sit with folks, listen to them, and also bring that back with us and those experiences back with us as best we can to be a support.
So then, what I'm hearing is that out to the black community, making friends with the black community, so having black friends, is one way in which we can express solidarity. But I've also heard arguments against that notion, right? That like reaching out and like, having black friends isn't enough, right? That like it can actually tokenize those individuals, which is something that I think Omar touched on. And so I wanted to know what the panelists' thoughts were about that argument, that like just having black friends isn't enough, that like talking to your black friends is enough, and that in fact tokenizes them, right? So like if that tokenizes them, what more can the Afghan American community do to express solidarity or to listen better? It's for anybody.
Well, who says that that tokenizes them? Is that coming from black people, or is that our assumption?
I've heard it, I mean, I've heard it personally come from black people, but I've also heard it come from others who are not black. And so that's the thing, right? Like it may or may not be enough. I'm not saying that it is enough for some people or not enough for other people.
I just feel
But
like
if it is not enough, what more can we do? How can we listen better if that is not enough?
Well, I just want to first say I feel like it only further tokenizes them when we continue to think that way. So we're only making that argument, we're only validating it even more so. I feel like we should normalize bringing them into our conversations. It shouldn't be something that we need to label as, us tokenizing the conversation. It should honestly just be a normal. It should honestly just be normalized. I think, for one, we need to get out of our comfort zone and stop looking at it as a sensitive thing to do. And so I think that that's the first step, is really to kind of get out of our comfort zone. And as far as how to branch out, I mean, Arash, you've had a lot more professional experience, and you've seen, yourself going out into the field, getting out there in action. So I'd really like to actually hear how, what your own personal contribution is, or what your thoughts are as to how we can contribute.
Yeah, this is actually a great question, because this is something I think about almost every day, because, like I said, I feel good about it if I post about it on social media, and then I get a bunch of likes, but then at the end of the day, that's not real action. If anybody who has a little bit of experience with organizing or working in communities, the real action has to be action. Real change is action based. So this is a question I ask myself every day. But I think the very first step is to be in solidarity. To stand up in solidarity, to attend important events, to attend protests, even if it means donating to social justice organizations. These are small ways, but these are the very first steps of standing in solidarity with people in the Black community. And on top of that, I see some in our community. I see some erasure of Black culture and Black bodies. For example, a significant amount of Muslims in this community in the United States are Black, but yet all the positions taken in Muslim organizations or even in other organizations are taken up by immigrant communities. So where are for example, where are the Black Muslim voices? So if we start taking small steps, whether it's standing in solidarity, or stop the erasure of the people within our own community. And also, people need to realize that race is just a social construct, and this is something we can't stop repeating, because I have now Latino people in my family. I have Black members in my family. So these are small ways that people can realize that we can stand in solidarity and actually do things, rather than just post things on social media and then feel good about it.
Can I ask a question, maybe, for the panel, and maybe even if people in general on Facebook or something, but what kind of responses people have been getting to to Black Lives Matter, if they've been getting anything, if people disagreeing or challenging the whole notion. I guess the reason why I asked that question is just because I've had some people kind of challenge that whole idea and be sometimes either being all lives matter, or criticizing why do you have Black Lives Matter? Why don't you call it Black Lives Matter 2? What is that? Why is it so divisive? And I feel within my circle, maybe it's becoming more clear. But I'm just kind of curious. I still run into that quite a bit, or people will be I'm down with Black Lives Matter, but I don't want them blocking the freeways. I don't want them standing and interrupting me on my way home and my commute. So what is that real solidarity? And if other people have actually run into that as well.
Yeah, sure. I've definitely read stuff about it. I read things people saying, oh, when you say the terms all lives matter, I forgot where I read this. Somebody probably posted it on Facebook, but that's going to a breast cancer event and saying, pancreatic, cancer matters too. You know what I mean? And it's so I see that. I love that people are coming to defense of this movement of this term Black Lives Matter, and essentially allowing it to remain just that and not taking away from what it stands for. I definitely side with, you know, with people that are in support of it, and not those that try to say all lives matter, because all lives matter is a complete different, you know, it's a different subject of its own. But I do feel like it is important to make that distinction and allow and come to defense of it when people are trying to challenge the idea, and that really takes us speaking up every chance we get, whether it's on social media or in person.
Nura, you live in the South, right? So when you express support for Black Lives Matter, have you gotten pushback in the form of no, all lives matter, or that's divisive, or the way that Black Lives Matter protesters go about expressing their support and solidarity, that's incorrect? Do you get that kind of feedback?
Yeah, I think you see the divide a lot where there's a lot of apathy from non-blacks. So I live in a campus community and it's a well-educated student community. But like we had a protest and for Black Lives in spring, and I remember one person being like, "It looks like they're having a picnic out there," and totally marginalizing what was happening, because part of the protest time there was a sit-in where there was professors speaking and people were gathered around and having a conversation, right? Like that was part of the movement that was happening in Durham. And someone was like, "This just looks like y'all are having a picnic," like totally demeaning it. People don't have empathy for the experience, so then when you can't see your lives in relation to another person, and when you don't value the life of another person in the same way you would value your cousin's life or your brother's life, you can emotionally detach yourself. And it's a really uncomfortable place to be, especially because I don't expect these kind of comments to come from well-educated people at an elite institution. So it's a really weird space to go, like being with people who are doing important work in the community, to going into a department in an institution and hearing these kind of comments made sort of like flippantly from by non-black students in academics. And that's a really lived reality. Like I wish I could say that these kind of comments don't exist, but having seen it firsthand, I also struggle with how do you push someone who's so emotionally detached and who can make such flippant comments. Like how do you push them to guys and kind of understand and come to a common ground about things? Because if we could do that, like at the end of the day, I think all people would say that they value human life, but then the reality of how that lives out looks different, and that's a really that's a challenge I personally struggle with trying to reconcile.
I wanna talk about the attachment that you just expressed. So there's an emotional detachment that you notice from elite educated individuals when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement. But then we see after the Dallas shootings an almost immediate emotional attachment to the phrase Blue Lives Matter. And so where is the immediate attachment to Blue Lives Matter coming from, and why is it that individuals can't really emotionally attach themselves to something like Black Lives Matter? And so why is it so much easier for us to do one thing versus another thing? And I don't know if Arash or Arzo want to take this one, or Noor if you want to as well.
I think I can kind of answer that. It's an interesting question, but the short answer is white supremacy is like very complicated, and when we as an Afghan community, you know, if you watch like the Baton Rouge police shooting or like the Dallas police shooting, it's almost like it's taught to us that, you know, we should value the people that are like sacrificing their lives on the line, and putting their bodies, you know, in jeopardy. But when we do that, we put them on different levels, right? If we care more about our firefighters and policemen, than we do about black bodies. That is an inherent narrative that the media portrays, and we should question that narrative. We should question narratives that are given to us every day. When media organizations go out and post a picture of a police officer doing something extremely nice, like helping a homeless person, we should question that narrative, that because that police officer is someone who is being paid by our tax dollars to do the job that we tell them to do, and we should hold them accountable. And I don't think we have an obligation to condemn any kind of police shootings, and we should realize that, you know, the president of the United States, he goes to Dallas when a shooting happens, and he immediately condemns when police officers are shot in Baton Rouge. But we don't see that same kind of level of mourning, and basically a state funeral was not held for any of the black bodies that were killed. So we should question the narratives that are given to us, that are fed to us, that are given to us almost every day.
Can I add to that? I think one of the biggest issues, to Arash's point, is accountability. That the biggest upset is that we have not seen any accountability for the lives of innocent people. So we see that accountability in certain ways, like when police officers' lives are lost, right? There is an immediate reaction of like, let's catch whoever it was, and the consistency. I think it's fair to have consistency across the board, and we see complete inconsistency when Black lives are lost. Where's accountability? Who has actually served in prison time for these actions, for the murders that have happened this year and continue to happen? And how do you expect people not to react when we see a lack of accountability from a system that's supposed to protect all of us?
One thing it's interesting because it's like when we say Black Lives Matter, like obviously that doesn't include any Afghans, but if you say Blue Lives Matter, which a lot of people got really attached to, like there are Afghan cops, like that's the reality. You know, there's a lot of, I have friends and people within in our community who work in law enforcement and who do risk their lives in every day, and so that's something that is a struggle of like. With the whole, being critical of law enforcement and what's going on, while at the same time, I think it's cool that we have Afghans that are in law enforcement. My hope is that we don't, aren't feeding into that system. But that's something that I struggle with and wrestle with, is like being critical, being pro Black Lives Matter, but at the same time respecting folks within especially our community who might be serving in law enforcement, who I think can serve a good purpose.
So I heard the word accountability, and I think that that word was spoken by another individual who posted on our Facebook event thread. And in case you're watching and you have a question, you can always post questions onto our Facebook event thread, or contact any one of the panelists if you have their personal information. Let them know that you have a question, and we'll discuss that question here. But one of the posts that was made was about accountability of the Afghan community with their own internal racism. And so this is sort of transitioning away from the Black Lives Matter movement and talking about the internalized racism and the accountability that doesn't seem to exist within the Afghan-American community, at least identified by others, with regards to ethnic communities like the Hazaras, or like religious communities like the Shia Afghans, who by and large are silenced and are oppressed. And in fact, on July 23rd, suffered a massive attack in Kabul. 80 individuals were dead, scores more were injured, and it was mainly Shia Hazaras who died. And just as a note, there was also another attack in Kabul this morning that occurred. So once again, Kabul bleeds. Not even, barely even a week later from the previous attack. And so with the accountability being asked for police officers here in America, that poster was basically asking, where's the accountability for Afghans with our own internalized racism? And so I wanted to transition to our next topic about our own place within the community, within the Muslim American community, by asking, how can we stand in solidarity with other minority communities, while at the same time there's silence and oppression happening within minority Afghan communities. And I think, Arzo, being the director of the organization that you're a part of, I think you'd be best suited to answer this question.
Well, my job, yeah, I can speak to that, but I would actually like to speak. So, as somebody who, comes from a Pashtun background, like, my parents, my mom especially, she's this like proud, Wardaki woman, and uses every opportunity to explain. And I love her pride for her culture and her background. I really, truly do. But I have always kind of had to put my mom in check when it came to her very pro-Pashtun mentality, because I don't know if you want to call me a contrarian by nature, but I've always recognized that that was a divisive way of thinking, and so I feel like a lot of it starts at home. I do have two younger sisters, one who is very, very young. I mean, she's a freshman in high school, and I don't ever want her to see the difference between a Sunni or Shia. My father has always had us identify as just being Muslim first, and never Shia or Sunni. And I want her to not see the difference between the two, or between any other ethnic groups. We have enough ethnic disparities across our racial lines in Afghanistan as it is. And so I do feel like a lot of that starts at home. It starts in the home base. And if we can impact or change the way our parents think, then we can ultimately change the way that we all view as one another outside of the home in our broader community.
So does anybody else want to answer the question of, like, how can we stand in solidarity with minority communities in the United States when the minority communities within our own diaspora and within Afghanistan itself suffer from the sort of internalized racism that we inflict upon them? I see you nodding your head, Arash.
I think we can stand in solidarity with other communities, but we can, at the same time, we can hold ourselves accountable as well, whether it's sectarian issues or ethnic issues. I think what you actually said at the conference, which is, inclusion over exclusion, that's such a powerful message. We spend so much time nitpicking people's views or backgrounds or looks. Once we get past that and try to be more inclusive and stop trying to be exclusive, I think that's a very powerful message. And when we start to, I'll put it this way: we can work on ourselves while we also fix other segments and other parts of society that we're part of. We can do both at the same time.
Yeah, sorry, my microphone, my bad. But yeah, I think I agree. I totally agree with Arash that we can do both. I think that we do have that racism that exists within that prejudice that exists within our community. When I think of it, I think of, like, in more American context. Racism is systematic. It's something where institutions are involved, and for me, the systems, the institutions that I have the most effect on, and what I can change the most, and to really tackle that systemic racism, is within the United States. And as much as we do have prejudice, and we have these things that are happening within our community towards, and I'm speaking as somebody who doesn't necessarily come from one of those, historically kind of marginalized communities within Afghanistan. So, obviously I come with that privilege of not always having to think about it at all times. I don't know. For me, it's like, people aren't dying in the U.S. because they are part of these, communities. We have folks it's a sense of urgency. That doesn't mean we don't also address it. But I do think every time something comes up with Black Lives Matter with other communities, we always have to bring it back to our community compared to something we do that we're not doing. It's like, why can't we just sometimes just focus on strictly on Black Lives Matter? So that's kind of where I go with that.
I think my question / comment would be, are we complicit in the hurting and are we complicit in white supremacy? Because when we come to this country, when we come to America, we are the work has already been done, and most of that work has been done at the expense and at the pain of black bodies and black lives. And so when we enter society, we're already a leg up above certain other marginalized communities. So are we complicit in this?
I don't think we're complicit, but I think we take it for granted, for sure. I think we take our privilege for granted. We don't understand, and I think we're only now coming to terms with the fact that we have to defend our identities. We have to defend our right to be who we are in this current in our this current political and social climate that we're in right now with Islamophobia and all these terms, derogatory terms towards Muslims that are going around right now. But we're only now just facing these challenges and more and more every day. And I think that we take for granted the fact that we even have the freedom to defend ourselves. But that's my take on it.
And I just want to clarify real quick, not to say that, I think some of the stuff I said may have come off like, kind of insensitive, but one of the things is like, for me, again, like I grew up, my neighbor, like one of my best friends growing up was black, like that family was someone I was really close with, and I can't necessarily change what's going on in Afghanistan. Like the prejudice that exists here, we have to address it, we have to do it, but what is going on and the people that are actually dying and, who are really, most affected in those things, I don't always have that same personal connection with. So I think I'm complicit in that sense, where I probably don't do enough to address that issue. Yeah, just something that came to mind right now. I think, Nura, you.
Yeah, I think it's an uncomfortable reality to deal with, but in my opinion, we are complicit in white supremacy because, like Arash was saying, like a lot of society, even where highways are built, it's built through black neighborhoods, right? Just the system of like how our homes are built, where our homes are, right? And when our parents tell us to be like someone, they usually don't tell us to be black, telling us to aspire to whiteness. So even just who we aspire to be like, when we say to be American, who we imagine our minds is usually not a black individual. And I think that there's many ways we benefit and are complicit in the system that we're not intentionally doing, but I think it's okay to sit in the discomfort that in many ways we are complicit. And I think only when we come to that realization can we move out of that system. It's a system we're all a part of. Even like very radical black academics who try to push back against the system, they're working at places like Harvard and Duke, and they're getting paid by these places that they're critiquing. So we're all part of that system. No one is innocent of that, but I think if we have that understanding, it puts us in a position to move forward in a more productive way.
So speaking of complicity, earlier in the conversation, someone mentioned that we don't see a lot of black Muslims being recognized by other Muslims, right? And so there's a racial component to how we identify other Muslims within the community. And so how does that play into, like, what is the role of the Afghan-American community? Is it our role to stand up for more black Muslims being included in our conversations? Is it our job to ask for more conversations about race in our masjids, in our khutbahs? How does that play out in us shaping our identity within the wider Muslim American community? And let's Omar, I want to ask you this question.
Yeah, man. This has come up. We've had conversations about like, hey, if you don't like something here in your masjid, like, change it, do something about it, and like, talk to the people that are doing it. And I'm the first one to be like, I'm not trying to deal with those people. And I'm again, that's on me, right? Like I have probably kind of boxed those folks in as being people who may not necessarily be as open to change, but there are those people out there. Like for me, I just like the internet is a lot oftentimes where I go for a lot of that stuff. Like I'll find khutbahs or things that are addressing racism and that stuff. So I just kind of end up turning to that more so than I do to my local areas or masjids and stuff, because I don't know, I don't always want to deal with that, and it's uncomfortable, but I know it's something that needs to happen, and I think I need to do better, but calling myself out right now.
But is it easy to go talk to your masjid? Is it easy to go talk to your imam and ask for a conversation about race, or ask for a conversation about Black Lives Matter, or ask for a conversation about Black Muslim bodies, being a part of the Muslim diaspora? And how do Afghan Americans go about that in our communities, right? We have some pockets, right, where there are a lot of Afghan Americans, Fremont, the Valley, the DMV area, So like in those pockets, like how do we go about bringing, how do we go about defining our role in those pockets? So if Arash and Arlo want to talk about that.
These are really good and tough questions, and this is something we always grasp with. I think the thing we need to ask ourselves: are we gonna go into the spaces that already exist and try to change those and put in the hard work there and make those better, or do we create alternative spaces where we kind of can set the values and the foundation for something more inclusive and more progressive, and that challenges the envelope in terms of the conversation of Black Lives Matter, for example. So I mean, I don't have the answer, but that's an excellent question we should all ask ourselves.
So speaking of going in and changing places, or not changing places, but like creating alternative spaces or changing spaces that already exist. Arzo, in your work, like what have you seen to be like the normal strategy, the strategy that most people tend to do? Is it creating alternative spaces, or is it sort of changing spaces that already exist?
Well, I mean, with the work that I do, it's funny because it's not like Omar. It's I don't necessarily always want to deal with the challenge of having to convince a member of Congress or a political leader of why an issue or why Afghanistan is important. So I'm always talking about Afghanistan. I'm trying to keep it relevant in the conversations. And with this particular situation, with this particular topic, I feel like it's only as hard as we make it for ourselves. And I think that the struggle really begins with trying to prove why it's important in the first place. And so, one of the things that I'm working on right now, I have a friend, his name is Jared Adams. He spent 9 years in prison. He was sentenced to 27. He was exonerated by the Innocence Project. He ended up coming out, got his bachelor's, got his law degree, and then clerked for the very prosecutor for the very judge that actually put him in the prison in the first place. And I'm bringing Jared into these conversations with the Afghan community, with Make Space, an organization in Virginia. I want to pitch it to them because they're going to start having these roundtable discussions. And I feel like that's a perfect platform to bring in somebody like Jared and in a room with Afghans and Muslims and bring in this real person and make the conversation relevant. Essentially humanize essentially make it a real conversation and make it important, bring it to their face rather than, because we can share on social media all day long, but I feel like when you are in person, being interactive with these issues, then it makes it much more real, and so yeah, that's one way I'm at least going to try tackling or addressing the issue in our community.
And so it seems to me the consensus is that like our role is to try to have conversations more, right? Have conversations more with imams, have conversations more with our spaces that already exist. But what are some examples of alternative spaces that do exist now that can hold the kinds of conversations that we would like to have, conversations about Black Lives Matter, et cetera. And what do Afghan Americans do in creating those kinds of spaces, alternative spaces? Omar, I don't know if you've seen something like that in the Fremont area.
You know, I can kind of give an example of what, like for example, we've always had Palestine has always been an issue for a lot of Afghans, and like that was something we, in terms of like traditional forms of activism, like whether it's protests or attending things, you saw that coming through Palestine, I would say. And so, like for me, we organized this like a town hall. We basically took over a town hall and just kind of pressed the congressman on stuff that was happening. And then the problem was that it took the bombings that were happening in Gaza to really get people motivated, and it's trying to maintain that consistency and creating that space of like having those conversations and addressing things and being active outside of just big events that take over your newsfeed. So that's where I often struggle with in terms of finding, and I think hopefully we can do a better job of making that happen.
Yeah, actually, like you bring up an interesting point about what happens in our news feeds. There seems to be a like a big sort of motivation, right, for young or old Afghan Americans to be really active about things like Palestine. And do you guys feel like the activity on issues like Palestine seems to harm or help our own activism as Afghan Americans in the Muslim American community?
If I can answer that, I think it absolutely. I think the issue is important, but the way it is used is it's almost tribal in a way, because we associate the Palestinian cause with us because we are Muslims. But the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, has associated themselves and stood in solidarity with Palestinians and Palestine. They've gone to the West Bank, they've gone to Gaza Strip, and said, "Hey, we stand in solidarity with you." And then when members of the Israeli community have tried to stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, they've pushed back and said, "Hey, we're not okay with what you're doing over there." So if I think, and I'm surprised nobody has used this word in the minutes we've been on this talk, but there's an intersectionality to this. When we care about Black lives, we can also care about Palestinian lives, and there's oppressive systems in place that it's the same system that's oppressing people in Palestine that is oppressing Black bodies in Ferguson and Baton Rouge and Baltimore. So we can, rather than letting all our energy go to one issue, we can link the issue of patriarchy, of white supremacy, of apartheid, of the oppression of people in Gaza and the West Bank.
Can I add to
So,
that?
yeah, please.
One of the things I've been thinking about, and we mentioned it earlier, was like the minorities in Afghanistan. Is like it's really easy for us as Afghans in America to think about other oppressed people and relate to them. As Afghans, it's really uncomfortable to think that we have privilege. And I think about it that in Afghan, I'm also not part of like one of the marginalized minority groups in Afghanistan. So it's very weird, honestly, to think about the fact that I'm part of a community that in Afghanistan likely has the probability of oppressing others. And I think that if we have the bandwidth to bring up Gaza and Qutbas and mosques, that we really should make a concerted effort to bring up like the gross reality of how we mistreat minorities in Afghanistan, or even here, like living in communities like in California, do we treat all Afghans the same? And I just wanted to return to that point because I've been thinking about it. Like when you are in a space where you're always thinking about yourself as a minority in America, it's really strange to then think about that in other contexts you do hold privilege. And in a context of being an Afghan, I do hold more privilege than others, and I don't see the same level of outrage when the protests happened and the Afghans were targeted. I didn't see the same level of outrage that we saw in other times when Kabul was bleeding, and it's an uncomfortable reality that I think that we have to sit with and really re-examine. And I don't know if this was the right time to bring that up, but it was still sort of sitting in my mind, so I just thought I'd share that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, speaking of Palestine and just like when things are happening in Afghanistan, like for me personally, when someone says like starting at home, like fixing kind of, I think of my community, I think of the Afghan-American community, but I kind of distance myself from the community of in Afghanistan, and same thing in Palestine, like those kinds of like what's going on there. It's hard to, for me, it's really important to be active and working on issues within the United States and trying to help that. Like that's like for me that's home. So that's where I can make the most impact. Not saying that you don't do that or that you can't. But I do think that when we say like start at home, like for me it's within like our families and all those things, but then also like within the context of the United States. That's where we can make the most impact in my opinion.
So speaking of within the context of the United States, and going back to Nura's point about there being contexts where, as an Afghan individual, you do have privilege, and it's hard to reckon with that. There are some anxieties within the diaspora community here in the United States, or in North America in general, or in Western Europe, or Europe in general. There's some anxieties about being a model minority, right? A quote-unquote model minority. How does that affect our identity and our solidarity with Black bodies and Black Lives Matter? How does that affect our view of ourselves when we are confronted with the internalized oppression of Hazaras or Uzbeks or individuals who don't come from Kabul? Right? How do those anxieties about being a model minority, maintaining the privilege that we have latched onto, how do those affect our ability to stand in solidarity with other oppressed individuals?
I can try and tackle that one.
Go for it.
When we're asked to be a model immigrant community, that is in a way it's to appeal to whiteness in a way, right? Because the standard of being a model immigrant community is something that was done by European white communities that came before us, and we are asked to perform at that standard and at that level, while not being accepted at that same level that the Poles, the Germans, the English were, right? The Afghan community is not accepted in the same way. The Latino community is not accepted in the same way. The Black community isn't accepted in the same way. But I do think that there's a quote that somebody said, if we can't fix ourselves in Fremont, in D.C., and LA, then how can we fix all the things at home in Kabul and Mazar Sharif and Kandahar? So I think that's important.
Nura, how do you think that, or if Nura is frozen, Omar, how do you think that anxieties about being a model minority in this country affect our ability to stand in solidarity with other oppressed individuals? And it looks like Nura is not frozen anymore. So, Nura, if you want to answer this question.
Yeah, I think that it does affect us in some way because it's asking us to get close to a certain individual and distance ourselves from others. So even like, I had a really weird moment like growing up in public school where the advanced placement classes were with white students and the people who were in like the regular classes were non-white. And so my social circle and who were in my classrooms were different, and I was being pushed to be with certain people who didn't look like me. And so it's like this is a very like sort of anecdotal moment, but even in like elite spaces, like when we come here, like we're like for our family, for our parents, we want to aspire to do the best, but at the expense of whom, right? Like, are we doing that and doing it in conversation with other people, or are we doing it and distancing ourselves from other minorities or Black and brown bodies? And I do think that there's a bit of distancing that happens where we want to play the good part, but while we play the good minority part, then that means that we're putting someone in a villain's role. And so then the tension is like, how do you be a productive member of society without marginalizing others? And I think it's a really complicated system. And it also gets to the question of what is whiteness. And I think it's something that we don't have like proper vocabulary understanding around, that as a community we really need to understand like what that looks like in order to know like how we play a part in it.
Omar, I'm going to throw not the exact same question to you, but another related question. Do you see the Muslim community uh, pushing back at all against the anxieties of being a model minority? And do you see Afghan Americans or the Afghan American community that you're in contact with, do you see them uh, pushing back alongside against that model minority anxiety?
So when you're saying that, just to help me clarify, like, are you saying kind of when I think of model minority, it's like, hey, we don't have any problems kind of thing, and we've got all our stuff together. Is it more of like airing out our dirty laundry? Is that
Well,
I think
or
I'm a little
pushing back
confused.
against the base need for us to be a model minority. So it can involve airing out our dirty laundry, or it could involve attacking the very notion that we need to be that.
Hmm. No, I mean, I think that uh, we do see. I mean, I'm seeing more people like talk about these issues and like address them, but it's just like a matter of seeking them out and really just trying to find those folks. I think that's probably the what I try to do and how I try to combat that. I personally think that like yeah, we want to go to school, we want our degrees, we want to have everything in line for us to be successful in the future, but it also has to include that kind of self-reflection, that kind of self-work, and at times like just owning up to the fact that we participate in some like messed up things, and that we have that within our own community where we are oppressing others. And I think it's okay to have those conversations and just be open and really frank about those things. So.
So let's we're almost to where we start, an hour from when we started. So I mean, I think that we've discussed in two parts the question of what is the role of the Afghan American community in terms of both standing in solidarity with movements like Black Lives Matter, but also in terms of defining ourselves within the wider Muslim American community. And so if each of you could like just sort of share like one sort of anecdote or story or something, or an opinion even, about what that role is. It's a big question, but narrow it down as you see fit. But like, what have you seen be the role of Afghan Americans within the wider Muslim American community? And we'll start with Arash because he's on my left.
I think our role is to kind of stop dancing around the issue so much. I feel like we got to kind of push the envelope, and we should not be afraid. The Black Lives Matter approach is to basically kind of annoy people, right? Like they show up everywhere. They show up at your favorite socialist candidates rally, and they interrupt them, and they yell over them, and they hurt a lot of feelings. They go to highways, and they make sure you're an hour and a half late to work. When we stop worrying about people's feelings, and as the Afghan community, we start placing the importance of Black lives, right, the black bodies above people's feelings and unwillingness to deal with the issue. That's when I think we'll make some progress in the issue.
Nura?
I don't know what our role is in the Muslim community, and it's something I think is our place. One thing I think a lot about Afghans in general is that there were resilient people that have suffered so much and still continue to try to be optimistic in the face of all the violence our families have seen, and the continuing violence that happens. We've been resilient, and I think if we take that resilient spirit, and if that's something we can contribute to the broader Muslim community, that'd be amazing. But I think that we have a lot more potential as Afghans to contribute to the Muslim American community and to the broader community beyond Muslims that we haven't fully realized yet. And I think that I would ask us to push ourselves to get there. And I don't think we're quite there yet. So that's why I'm sort of still left reflecting on, like, we have all this untapped potential that I think we can still fulfill that we haven't quite gotten to. So that's sort of where I'm at.
I guess it's my turn, but I think that just within the Muslim, I mean, we deal with the issues of white supremacy and institutionalized racism. We talk about Black Lives Matter. That's at the end of the day, it's racism, and Islamophobia is another form of racism, and the Muslim identity has become it's almost like a new racial minority. So even if people don't necessarily identify as Muslim who are Afghan, these issues affect them. But I'd like to see more. I think the Muslim community is doing a lot to ally with Black Lives Matter. For me, looking at people like Linda Sarsour and kind of what they're doing and how they're really leading the way, and places like MuslimGirl.net, and Halima, who's someone who's been on TSN and writes with them, and doing awesome things. Arash, people who are making these things happen, and having this impact, and being more out there and open in the community and showing that they can tackle and address these issues is important. Yeah, I guess for me it's just continuing that and just continuing to see more people really just be active in that.
Okay, so unfortunately, it looks like Arzo had to jump off, but hopefully you enjoyed tonight's discussion. We tried to tackle the Afghan-American role in expressing solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in light of the recent shootings and the perpetual system of racism and violence that is inflicted against black bodies. We also tried to ask the question about what is the Afghan-American role within the Muslim community, considering all of our own prejudices, considering our own internalized racism, and how we tackle that. So if you want to watch more of our videos, you can always go to our YouTube channel. The link will be in the Facebook event thread, or you could just Google or look up on YouTube.com the Samovar Network. We are now the first search result there. So nice milestone that we reached. Yeah, if you have any other questions, please feel free to ask them in the Facebook event thread. Otherwise, it has been a pleasure speaking with the panelists. It's been a pleasure having you watch, and good night.